Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull. The show about stuff most people try to avoid, but can't because it controls their lives. Religion, culture, and politics. Why does Bill Hull host this show? Because he and Bonhoeffer hoisted a few brews together in Berlin. Nope. That never happened. Is it that Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, both challenged and changed Bill as a young man? Well, yes, that is part of it. But it's primarily because Bonhoeffer called us to a costly discipleship, and there has never been a time when such courage has been more absent or desperately needed than now. Bonhoeffer famously said, "Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ." The Bonhoeffer Project is committed to turning leaders into disciple makers, because if leaders fail to create disciple-making movements, then we have failed. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is. He's still tall and good-looking, and yes, he is wearing German cologne. He's acquired a few more underlying conditions, but direct from his underground bunker in Long Beach, California, the man who once told Don Henley, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave," Bill Hull.
Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show. How y'all doing? Great. Well, it's just me today. That's all right. More of me is not always the bad thing. But being a podcast host, you're always having to come up with material. And the beauty of it all is that people help me along the way. For example, I was reading this article recently. I'll hold it up here. It's called "The Wasting of the Evangelical Mind." Peculiarities of how American Christianity took shape help explain believers' vulnerability to conspiratorial thinking and misinformation, by Michael Liu, March 4th, 2021, The New Yorker magazine, if you'd like to read it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And today about the wasting of the evangelical mind. And our author has a proclivity toward the conspiratorial himself, as he thinks in terms of why evangelicals and their minds led to the insurrection on our Capitol on January 6th, I believe it was, in this year. So this is not a political show. It's just taking events and trying to explain them in light of other truths. So I'd like to start with Charles Malik. I've used this quote a number of times, but it keeps coming back into my mind because Malik was a Lebanese diplomat. He was on the organizing committee of the United Nations. He was a great scholar and a professing and practicing Christian. So here is what he said. The problem is not only to win souls. So he's writing from a Christian perspective in this case, and it was called The Two Minds. And he gave this talk, I believe, at the Billy Graham School of Evangelism, or the Billy Graham Evangelism Center in Wheaton, Illinois. I believe at its dedication, there were about 10,000 people there, including Billy Graham himself. He said, the problem is not only to win souls, but to save minds. If you win the whole world and lose the mind of the world, you will soon discover you have not won the world. Voila. Evangelicals, we woke up a few years ago and realized that we might have been able to count many, many people who had said they have come to faith, but we're finding those very same people that somehow their minds did not come along with it. And if their mind doesn't come along with it, then their lifestyle and their interpretation of life and the way they identify themselves, all these things are different. and they're not necessarily the right thoughts or what we call biblical concepts. So the above title was the subject of an article in the New Yorker by Michael Liu, and I don't know Michael. He, I think, is a intelligent man, or he wouldn't be in the position he is. And there's one thing I noticed from the start: the author didn't understand the Christian mind, at least as I understand it, nor did he have an evangelical mind. In other words, he wasn't able to get into the evangelical mind, because I don't believe he's an evangelical. And for those of you who are wondering, well, what is an evangelical? It's kind of hard to identify, actually. But evangelical means that they believe in the authority of Scripture. They believe in the deity of Christ. They believe that we have a mission to the world, a rescue mission, to tell the world about Christ and about his redemptive plan and rescue mission for the world, that personal conversion is really important, and engagement in that mission is equally as important. So that's how I would define an evangelical. And he did draw heavily from Mark Noll's book, and it was a polemic issued 27 years ago, The Scandal of the American Mind, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, a book that I read then, and I remember it was a good book. I wrote lots of notes in the margins, in the front and the back, and I kept that book. And it survived 2 or 3 purges of my library that I've gone through in the last 20 years. But additionally, I listened to much of it again as I was working out daily for a couple of weeks anyway. And as I was listening to this, I realized, kind of what in 95 the evangelical crisis was and the scandal of the evangelical mind was. But the article was informative for young readers who did not live through that period, the last 50 years of evangelical development and, we could say, decline. But like the author himself, I must take issue with the author's premise and overall purpose in writing the article. But simply put, the article represents a connection between the lack of serious intellectuals in the evangelical community to the attack on the nation's capital on January 6, 2021. Now, that's quite a leap, my friends. It makes Kierkegaard's leap of faith look like just a safe step. More specifically, some of the more prominently dressed and vocal rioters who said prayers. Remember Chewbacca Man? He is the guy with the funny hat on and the horns, and he had painted his face, and he walked into the House of Representatives, and he stood in the speaker's place and chair, and I think he said a prayer of blessing over that chamber, that holy chamber, we call it. All right, so Chewbacca Man, go down in infamy. And somehow this could have been avoided if real Christians had graduated from Harvard. That's my characterization. Or at least a privately held Eastern Seaboard college. Maybe if these people knew the difference between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotelian philosophy, they could have avoided going down this biblical rabbit hole. Because of this ignorance, these limited in mind, these wooden-headed literalists wouldn't have fallen for, and it became easy prey for QAnon. I can barely say it, QAnon, conspiracy theories. Now, have you ever tried to figure out what QAnon is? And I know HBO has tried it with about an 8-part series. And I've watched some of this. I'm going in and out on it. And it is really a squirrely, really twisted, ridiculous in so many ways series. After much research, the only solid answer that I was able to find about who Q is John Cleese, Faulty Towers, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. Monty Python, yes, that John Cleese. I like John Cleese. He's really a funny guy, but he played Q, I believe it was, in one of the James Bond films. I think Cleese would enjoy being known as the founder of QAnon because he could ridicule the idea better than anybody else I know. A few QAnon is a few crackpot ideas perpetrated on the internet by a variety of people, usually some very high IQ and some very low IQ people who are alternative types, let's say. And they recite great monologues into their cell phones, and then they organize it into some kind of computer program and they send it out on the internet. And all the other disaffected, alienated people in the world go, oh, that's kind of interesting. There are people who have conspiratorial kinds of mentalities. I don't know if it has anything at all to do with evangelicals, because I don't know any evangelicals who believe in any kind of these weird conspiracies. Now, I don't know all evangelicals, that's for sure, but I don't think it's a very prominent thing at all. I don't know of any leader or any pastor or any writer that takes any of it seriously. And I think the idea that somehow that any credible leader that's considered important in the evangelical community had a hand in this attack or in any way was supportive of it is just preposterous. And it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, I would agree that Donald Trump bears some responsibility because he not only challenged the election, which was his right, his legal right, but he went too far. And his pathology, remember when he was a birther and he was questioning Obama's birthright and where Obama had been born in the United States, that maybe he had been born in some other country and that kind of thing. And he took it to the extreme. And so that's part of his own pathology. I'm not defending it. I recognize it as something that was there. I also agree that the gatherings in Washington, D.C. that day consisted of many Christians. But 99% of them did nothing illegal and peacefully left the area. It seemed to be obvious from subsequent research that whatever was being planned was pre-planned, and that 1% of the overall group and only a small fraction of them had bought into any kind of conspiracy. And I think this weakens the author's premise that conservative Christians don't think critically or have abandoned reason for faith. It also demonstrates an obvious oversight. And he missed the huge growth industry in the evangelical minds of apologetics. Apologetics has become, there's been a resurgence of that in the evangelical community. It's the amount of books, the amount of academic work and philosophical work in the last 50 years has really been burgeoning in the evangelical community. So I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about, this author. That's why I don't think he really understands evangelicalism, even post-evangelicalism, which is sort of a wilderness, but I don't think he recognizes that either or understands it. He also has confused Christianity with a few guys in bunkers and basements posting rants on the social networks. Not realizing that most people that are responsible for what happens in the evangelical world are not involved in that at all. So the author states that the intermingling of religious faith, conspiratorial thinking, and misguided nationalism on display at the Capitol offered perhaps the most unequivocal evidence yet of America's church's role in bringing the country to this dangerous moment. And I just have to say that is a ludicrous statement. It's a false statement. And so he's talking about the wasting of the evangelical mind. I'm going to challenge that and say the secular mind is the one that's wasted and confused and morally has no moorings. But we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But right now, our world-class announcer, Steve Simmons, is going to tell us about the Bonhoeffer Project. And you might feel like as a pastor that you're just out in a stream that's been poisoned with a bucket, and you're trying to get the bad water out and get the good water in, and you're frustrated. and your efforts aren't really making much of a difference. If that's you, then listen to what Steve Simmons says now and just do it. Don't argue with me. Don't mess with me. Just go ahead and do it. And go to our website and look at this great video of me trying to be Liam Neeson in Taken. It's kind of sad, but I did it anyway. Okay, here's our break. Here we go.
We turn leaders into disciple makers. That's the mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. But before we can turn you into a disciple-making leader, we need you to be in a cohort. A cohort is a 1-year, 10-meeting, book reading, praying, wrestling, writing, planning challenge that has the potential to change you and thus redirect your life. Interested? Here's the process. Go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, and complete the application form. We will contact you. We will then help you select the type of cohort that's best for you. In person, online, or online school, which is asynchronous, so it's not affected by time zones and anyone in the world can access it. Oh, and training is now also available in Spanish. In the meantime, subscribe to the show, read one of Bill's books, and send us a question you want Bill or some member of the Bonhoeffer team to answer. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back. Thank you, Steve Simmons. Obey him right now. In fact, I'll give you permission while I'm talking to go to our website and change things around, all right? And get involved. Yes, sirree. All right. Now, let's just continue here. Did you notice something in our, I might call it a ridiculous conclusion of the author? Did you notice how the First Amendment has been flipped? Yeah. Instead of the state, the First Amendment prohibits the establishment of the government of any religion. All right? And that's not to protect the government. That's to protect the freedom of religion. Instead of the state being dangerous to the freedom of religion, religion is now dangerous to the health of the state. And that's how the argument always goes when those who are, let's just say, have a more confidence in governmental work than they do God. Religion is how the state becomes the victim. The state, not the people and their God-given rights, is what needs to be preserved. So it's interesting that as soon as they had this attack on the nation's capital and one documented person has been killed, and that person was a protester. And this is, if you want to look at the Washington, D.C., the coroner's official report on the 5 people that died during this period of time, only one is verified as a result of the actual event itself. Now, that's not even a political statement, but it's interesting how the scenarios get presented and they are repeated again and again and again and again by the media, and they turn out to not be true. So this is the line of argument taken by the Catholic Church to start the Inquisition, is you protect Congress rather than Congress protecting the people's rights. And our rights have been given to us as God-given rights. And the state's role is not to grant those rights, it's to preserve them, it's to protect the people so that the people can have their rights. It's also the same line of thought where the church becomes a danger to the state. It's the consistent apologetic for tyrannical governments who intend to silence or challenge their power. Because there is one thing that tyrants don't like, is to be challenged, and certainly challenged by a mystical power that cannot be fought in any traditional or conventional way. So what's happening? The state turning its attention to the dangers of free religion. The press is free as well. And that's the First Amendment the freedom of the press. And the press is free to be, and they're protected by the same amendment to be as crazy as a fruitcake. And they have been, but they're free to do that. The church is free to be who they are. And we as the people are free. Again, there may be some churches who have been captured by conspiracy theories, but there always has been and there always will be around those kinds of groups. But this is not a serious or prevailing presence in the evangelical community or any churches of note. The author quotes studies by the American Enterprise Institute and others, but the analysis lacks precision. The idea of, for example, that 75% of the people who surveyed thought that there was a widespread voter fraud exist is not news. Everybody knows that, going back to the earliest days of our democracy, that there has been fraud, that there has been misrepresentation, that there have been some bad players. Remember Chicago back in the 1960 presidential election, and everybody knew and admitted later that Joseph Kennedy bought that election in the state of Illinois for his son, who became president of the United States. I mean, we know that there's always been some voter fraud. So the idea that voter fraud exists is not news. It really isn't. The issue is how much. And I think it was concluded by the courts and that there wasn't enough to make any difference, like in this former election, this most recent election. I think that the Antifa question is laughable. When somehow Antifa is, and some group, some people who they say are evangelicals, but really there's no way of demonstrating it or proving it, attack the Capitol. That's the same thing. It's a laughable comparison. This is the height of journalistic hypocrisy. The leadership elite and press were silent all summer during the riots and destruction of public property, the entry to police, the beating of citizens, clearly led by Antifa and BLM. But in this case, as I already said, one person died, and that was one of the rioters. This is because the press has been swallowed by their own political views and ceased to be trusted source for information. They, not the church, have lost their souls. And the fact that they're trying to, in a more genteel, intellectual way, make their point and turn it on the church is cynical, to say the least. All right, it's time for another break and listen to what Steve tells us to do. And he's going to be slightly different. There's some books you can buy. There's many videos. There's lots of good stuff. The weekly column that I write is on the website. There is all the former podcasts, if this is the first time you've listened or viewed this podcast. And my apologies if you have to watch. You can just listen to it. You don't have to go on YouTube and look at it. And all right, so now let's listen to Steve again, and then we'll be right back.
If you want to expand the disciple-making movement, then share the show with your friends and colleagues. Hey, it's easy to subscribe. Simply go to iTunes or to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com. Then click on The Bonhoeffer Show. Once you do, we will keep you updated with the Bonhoeffer Project's events, new materials and books, as well as the larger disciple-making movement current news. You can also access previous programs. And be sure to read Bill's weekly column, which is posted on the website. Remember, ask questions. Bill's answers are guaranteed to give you herd immunity, increase your IQ, and cause you to experience waves of euphoria. Well, not really, but his answers are really good. And now, let's get back to the Bonhoeffer Show.
Well, thank you, Steve. All right, let's talk about the evangelical mind a bit. This article presents a short history of some of the church's great minds. And you can kind of get a hint of where this guy's going. That the problems, are intellectual, and we're not intellectual enough, therefore we need to be more intellectual, and then people will take us seriously. And to me, this is the same kind of fallacious argument that you can make, let's say, as a means of evangelism. If you identify with Adolf Hitler and his followers, then you might be able to win them to Christ. There's a lot of people who believe that. So essentially, accommodation and appeasement. I don't think it works. The article presents a short history of some of the church's great minds: Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, Jonathan Edwards, who was one of these were heavyweights. These were serious heavyweights. Then it jumps to C.S. Lewis, who was less of a heavyweight, but really an important figure in the 20th century in Christianity and apologetics, and finally falls off a theological cliff with Reinhold Niebuhr, who I really do respect, and who himself was an influence upon Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but Bonhoeffer and he didn't agree and didn't get along that well. Reinhold Niebuhr was more of a sociologist than he was a theologian. He also was a very successful pastor in Detroit for many years. T.S. Eliot, a poet, and W.H. Auden, a poet. Now, I don't mean to speak ill of Niebuhr, Eliot, or Auden, but they are a very different kettle of fish from those previously mentioned. I believe Lou is correct in his statement that the most popular and influential pastors have tended to be the more, more public message that sells on television. In other words, today, the people know of famous televangelists, we might call them. And that reveals the Americana that exists in the gospel message, a product that can be plucked out from those and help those in pain and special need. But this trait is found in virtually every field of endeavor. Journalism is as practiced in the early 20th century, up through the Watergate age, is dead and gone. If you watch the movie All the President's Men, it's one of my favorite movies. Woodward and Bernstein, the two young reporters. That was the apex, the top of classic journalism in America. And then it began to die with the start of its decline. Woodstein, as they were called by Ben Bradley, he comes out of his office and he's really angry. Woodstein, come here, he says. And Jason Robards played that role so good for Ben Bradley. It was really sweet. Really liked that movie. It made their careers. Journalism became the thing, and people went into it to become famous, to practice the journalism that sells. And this is no more obvious than in present day cable news and the scramble among print media to survive. The tendency to extract the fashionable from the serious and to make it for profit is human. It's also very much Americana and part of the competitive nature that we have. Religion does it. All humans do it for themselves and for profit. Interviewing Prince Harry, for example, and Meghan Markle, who is estranged from the royal family, is done not because it's important, but because it sells. Just like cable news hosts who are partisan call themselves journalists. Some religious people take the gospel and corrupt it for personal gain and call themselves godly. That would be some of the people on television. Not all of them, maybe not even the most of them. Yeah, it might not be your taste. It may not be your cup of tea. You might find it gaudy and offensive in some ways, not something you really want to spend a lot of time thinking about or with, but still, it's part of Americana, and it's part of the marketplace. It's part of competition. It's part of what's brought robustness to the church. It's also what's brought some of the, I suppose, least Christian aspects of the church to the church. Now, let's talk about the pastor as a scholar theologian, because this seemed to be the underlying bottom line, both of Mark Knoll in his book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and of the author, Michael Liu, of this Wasting of the Evangelical Mind article. And in that they quote a scholar, Richard Hofstadter, and he says, the Puritan idea of minister as an intellectual and educational leader was steadily weakened in the face of the evangelical ideal of the minister as a popular crusader and exhorter. All right. I think that in the Puritan age, in the 1600s, the 1700s, with Jonathan Edwards in the 1700s, maybe the greatest mind of any American pastor in the history of the country. But regardless, that there's always been these people who have been the great minds and who are scholars. That's great. It's really needed. They are custodians of the truth, of philosophy, of theology, of reading the culture, of teaching leaders. Religion becomes part of the marketplace. It becomes competitive, and may the best salesman win. But that's the other part in the world of our communities of the evangelical church. Yes, true enough that it's made American Christianity robust and aggressive, but this is quite different than the parish idea that led to the great decline among higher sacerdotal Christianity with European base. You know, the parish idea is you get all the Lutherans, or you get all the Anglicans, or you get all the Baptists, or you get all the Catholics in this particular geographic zone. That's the parish idea. And so you just go to your specific, where your family goes, and that's how it works. Now, there's some appeal to that, but the answer is found in these groups, schools, and denominations that have adopted progressive deconstruction of the biblical text in order to accommodate and appease the fast-changing culture. This deconstruction has been led by once great universities, such as Harvard, which became too liberal, so there was Yale, which became too liberal, so there was Princeton. Well, Princeton's still kind of teetering there. But scholarship among evangelicals has grown substantially in the last 50 years. A growth of new and outstanding seminaries have exploded. But this is limited to those who operate within the academic community and society and are willing to give their careers to such work. So, you know, Bonhoeffer believed in sort of a religious nobility, where he would take the best and brightest in Germany and train them really, really well. And then they would be this force that could be sent out like the Navy SEALs to certain specific situations and address them and teach people and train people and protect Germany from falsehood. And this is really what he believed. Now, I think it was sort of very idealistic, very much what a scholar and academic would teach and believe, but essentially 98% of people aren't that way. They just aren't. And they aren't scholars. And in our time, they're not really even reading any longer. I mean, some of the statistics about this are startling. Like 55% of men after they graduate high school never read another book. If that's the case, what causes them to be willing to read a book? Well, a friend or accountability or relationship. Then they might start reading books. And in the Christian world, that happens when there's discipleship taking place. But it seems obvious that the majority of people are non-academics. For that same reason, pastors are as human as and apportioned in their giftedness and interest as other professions. So you can't just take, okay, every pastor will be a scholar, because not every person who becomes a pastor is a scholar. There are a few select ones who become scholars. There's second tier, which are hybrids, kind of academics in orientation, careful exegetes, but with a focus on the average person as their student. To this is added a sense of pastoral care and responsibility. So the third tier are biblically based, thoughtful, and action-oriented. They'd rather spend 20 hours a week with people than in their study making sure their sermons reflect the latest cultural niceties, or that their sermon notes include an appendix on the Medes and the Persians. Hopefully, these three tiers provide a balanced faith community, and the information of scholars, the pastor theologians, and the faithful practitioners will edify the entire church and make that the ideal is a church which is being led by scholarly contemplatives does not square with reality. It just doesn't. This is sadly a fourth tier. There is a fourth tier that is made up of users, exploiters, and charlatans. Yes, there are those. They give the Christian faith a bad name. Now, if you had, abusers, exploiters, and charlatans, and they were attorneys, people would say that's bad, not good. But after all, they're not purporting to be moral leaders. And so this is the real problem with the church, is that they are purporting, or we are purporting, that we are Christians and we are talking about a new humanity, a new community, a higher moral order, a higher level of living and behavior and motivation and kindness and love. And when that doesn't happen, of course, there's criticism, and rightly so. And I would suggest that journalists, media leaders, big tech executives take the words of Jesus seriously here, and first take a look at the timber in their own eye before they try to remove the speck out of another person's eye. Now, in our next program, I will address other portions of this article. I'm not sure if Mark Knoll would update his book now, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, but I will take a look at some of the circumstances then and now that and assess what progress has been made. So today we've really talked about the wasting of the evangelical mind, if we are to believe our friend. But I would challenge it and say that the mind that has been wasted is really the secular mind, and that the evangelical mind, imperfect, and yes, more conservative, yes, more rooted in faith, and faith with reason, not reason without faith, which is where the secular mind is. I think is a more balanced and healthy way to live, and more connected to reality. All right. So that's it. Well, I'm glad you were with me. And remember this: follow Jesus, and he'll teach you everything you'll ever need to know.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.